Good afternoon. Thank you firstly to the Gin Guild for inviting me here to talk. I've been trying to get away with it for 2 years, but this year I ran out of excuses, so here I am. Thank you to you as audience for finally still being here at 4 o'clock. That's good showing. The topic I've been given to talk about is the importance of ABV, the percentage game or gain. So many new gins are moving away from our standard 37.5 and even 40. Is this to impress or for good purposes? We'll find out. So I thought when I was given this topic to talk about how I was going to go about researching it, a little bit like Anne, I went on the internet and then I thought, like a good journalist does to us distillers, I would go and ask my colleagues. So I'm going to do a bit of a recap on the gin market and where it is today, understand why originally 37.5 and a bit about the legislation history, just a little bit, not too much. The role of alcohol in gin, and then the distiller's view, my view, and some views of my other distillers, 2 of them which are in the room today, which will be quoted. They did give me their permission to quote them. The trade's view, me having conversation with various trade members, mixologists, bartenders over the last couple of months, and some consumer view. It's all very short research, so it's nothing statistical. It's just a generic assumption on things, and then hopefully try and draw a conclusion. Okay, so if we just do a recap on the market and where it is today, just to kind of get this into context, gin actually still only represents 10% of the total spirit consumed. If we break down the gin category itself, the lion's share of the gin category is still in the standard category, where the majority of the gins there are actually 37.5 or 40. So most of the gins that are above that strength are occurring in our premium sector, which accounts for 20% of the total market. That said, that is where we're seeing most of the innovation, and most of the new gins are all coming out into the premium sector. So throughout the presentation, I am going to concentrate on the premium sector. So, history of legislation. So first of all, I had to remind myself, well, what does proof in ABV actually mean? So firstly, alcohol proof, well, it's the measure of how much alcohol is contained in an alcoholic drink. And this term was originally used back in the UK in 1816 by a system developed by Bartholomew Sykes. And if you remember, from our history days, Bartholomew Sykes was the guy that developed the hydrometer, which was the apparatus that were used to measure strength. So you would get your hydrometer, you would float in a sample of your alcohol. He also devised the tables that went along with this. So you take the temp of your sample, you would then consult the temp, that you would take your reading where the hydrometer floated. You then use that reading with your temperature alongside the tables, and it would tell you what your strength was. Apparently this method was quite rapid, and it took quite a while to come about. The excise department was actually established in 1643, so 200 years after the excise department was developed, this property of measuring proof was brought in. So we moved from proof to ABV, from what I can find, and again it's limited knowledge or information, on the 1st of January in 1980, which is when we moved from when we moved from proof to ABV. And the ABV is taken from the OIML system, which measures alcohol strength at a percentage of alcohol by volume at a temperature of 20 degrees C. And this was introduced on the 1st of January 1980 to the UK as a standard measure to measure alcohol. And this was to bring us in line with the rest of the EU. So why 37.5? Well, from what I can find from asking the WSTA on legislation, the 37.5 ABV was set as this minimum for the standard gin, and this was to bring it in line with this regulation goes back to 1989, and it was to bring gin in line with the rest of the spirits industry, so vodka, rum. But then you ask, well, why 37.5? That's the question I was trying to ask. And I can only surmise that this was linked to the definition, perhaps, vodka and the perfect balance between water molecules and alcohol molecules. So this leads me naturally on to talk about the role of alcohol in gin. We all know that to produce a gin, we need to redistill botanicals in the presence of alcohol and water. But firstly, we need to understand what is alcohol. Alcohol is ethanol or ethyl alcohol. It's produced by the fermentation sugars in the presence of yeast, whereby you get 1 mole of glucose converts to 2 moles of ethanol, and it gives you 2 moles of carbon dioxide. And there's our classical formula for ethanol. It's actually a volatile, flammable, colourless liquid with a boiling point of 78.4. The balance of alcohol, ethanol and water will impact on the texture as well as the impact on the flavour and the botanicals. And there have been various studies about the balance of the alcohol and the water. The first one that you probably remember or have heard of is the one that was done by Dmitri Mendov, who did some work back in 1865 on his dissertation when he was working on spirits at 70%. And he worked out the perfect ratio of alcohol, which was 38%. So he worked out the balance is, the perfect molecular balance of alcohol to water was 1 molecule of alcohol diluted with 5 molecules of water, which then converts to 38%. So essentially, alcohol is a solvent that can hold flavour. But how? To begin to understand this, we need to look back at how our sense of smell works. If we go back to our biology days, and I'm not a biologist, I'm not an academic, so this is going to be a very kind of school type level. We can recall, humans can recall 10,000 different aromas. Odours. And odours are made up of 1 or 2 molecules of aroma molecules. And of course, not all of us are going to be able to smell and detect all these different 10,000 odours. We also have what's known as a detection threshold, whereby there's a minimum concentration that the aroma molecule has to be for individuals to be able to smell it. We also need to be mindful that we don't also use our nose for smell. We actually also use our mouth as well. So when we actually swallow, the aromas will go from the back of the throat and up to the nose. It's actually the mouth and the nose that work together. One of the major factors that influence which odours we smell in the headspace of our drinks is linked to the physical characteristics of the different aroma molecules and how they behave in an alcohol and water mix. We have what is known as hydrophobic aroma molecules, and these are the ones that hate water, so desperately escape into the headspace where we will perceive them as aromas. We also have hydrophilic aroma molecules at the other end of the spectrum that love water, so they want to stay within the liquid. Alcohol itself has partial hydrophobic properties, so it's a love-hate relationship with the water, so to speak, which means the balance of the ethanol and the water will define which aromas we smell more than others. So, for example, at a higher ABV, which has more alcohol and less water, the more hydrophilic those water-loving aromas will move into the headspace. At the other end of this, on the flip side, at a lower ABV, i.e. less alcohol, more water, we have more hydrophobic aromas which will want to leave the liquid. So the demonstration I was trying to bring this point across with is I wanted to show you a gin. It's the same recipe, and I wanted to show you the gin at 40% and at a higher ABV to demonstrate that certain aromas you can get at 40, but you won't get them at higher strength. So on your paddle, you only have 2 gins from me today. You probably had all had lots already. So if you nose number 1 first, I'm afraid, again, they're quite small samples, and I did make them about a month ago. So you might not quite get this definition on the aroma, but you'll definitely get it on the taste. So if you nose 1 and taste 1 first, and then similarly go on to sample number 2. So the first one is at 40%, and the second one is at 48%. Okay. And what I'm trying to demonstrate here is what you'll notice, these are actually bloom gin. Anyone that knows me will know that Bloom was one of my creations and very fond and very passionate about it. And I'm very passionate about what ABV I put products at and what I create them at. So Bloom was created at 40% to have a subtle balance of these floral and citrus notes. It's a higher ABV of 48. You can't get any of those floral notes. You get a lot more of the bite from the alcohol. You get some of the peppers in there and some of the spice elements from the coriander and some of the angelica. And you also get quite a thin mouthfeel. So it gives the perception of a harsh alcohol taste. So therefore, my opinion, and I always hold true to this, Bloom works best at 40% ABV. And this is because it's a floral-led gin and it's very light in flavour. And when I developed Bloom, I knew instinctively that it needed to be a lower ABV whilst it was going to be put in the premium gin sector, because those floral aroma molecules are released into the headspace because they're typically hydrophobic. Okay, so that's the science bit over with, thank goodness. Nobody asked me any questions about that. Okay, so this is a bit where I thought, okay, so I've looked at legislation, I know what ABV and proof means. Oh, well, I've reminded myself of that. And then I thought, okay, well, I'm going to canvass some opinions. So I will go and speak to some of my fellow master distillers. So it's well known and understood for us distillers, the role of alcohol and the strength within that gin recipe. But we just express it in different ways and we talk about it in different ways. For myself, I always allow the choice of botanicals to drive the ABV that I need in the gin, much to the dismay of our marketing team. I'm quite vocal about it, as you can imagine. I'll always use that as well as a methodology and a tool when I'm creating gins. So Bloom, light and floral, I understand what flavour profile I want to create. And I will allow that once I know what flavour profile I want to create, I will allow the botanicals to dictate the final ABV. I don't start off with that's my brief and that's my ABV. My ABV tends to come at the end. It's not what drives me. It's driven at the end, kind of by accident sometimes. You just kind of know, which I know is not very insightful. I just kind of know what strength's going to work with what flavour I'm trying to develop. So I've asked a couple of my colleagues. Desmond is not here today, and they have all given me their permission to use these comments. So Desmond talks about how alcohol holds the distilled aromas and flavours. So again, you can see Desmond's talking about this hydrophilic properties of the aromas and how they interact with the balance of the water and the alcohol. Leslie, who is in the room somewhere, I can't see her, she's hiding at the back there. Leslie said she refers to the process, the steep time, and the important part of the ABV, but for her, comes before the distillation point where the botanicals are in steep. Finally, we have Mr. Maxwell. Charles talks about, do you remember this one? Now, yeah. You said before, what did I say? I can't remember. So Charles talks about the point of the spirit, the strength of the spirit is the only one part that makes up the total spirit drink. It's an important constituent, but it's only one of them. So what we're all collectively saying is that gin is made up of 3 building blocks. We have water, we have spirit, and we have botanicals. And it's our understanding of distillers on how these elements work that will help us define what ABV we want in our gins. So then I went and spoke to the trade to see what they thought about this. Their comments were, well, it depends on what cocktail you're preparing. I suppose if you're preparing a martini, a gin you choose for a martini will be very different to a gin you'll choose for a gin and tonic. They also said that they generally like higher ABVs, and that's because the intensity in cocktails, for example, in a Negroni, the other ingredients are so strong that you need a gin that can stand up to these ingredients. Then somebody went on in conversation to say, because it also potentially makes it easier for us to create the cocktails because the gin's already strong enough. So for us to balance it, it's easier. They also noted that consumers actually don't notice the ABV consciously, but they like to taste the gin in their cocktails. We did some training with Duty Free recently, and the consumers there, they were saying that they actually don't notice the higher ABV, apart from when they see it on the label it says imported. So it's not anything that they note, it's just that's on the bottle so they can see it. Also, some commerciality comes into this as well with the trade. At the end of the day, while we all have the passion and creativity to make something, we all want to make a bit of money out of it. If serving a mass market gin and tonic, they would use a lower standard gin because cost is important. So bartenders also agree that alcohol can determine so much of the character of the gin, from the mouthfeel to the flavour profile to the effect on the drinker, and of course the amount of money that heads to the HMRC. And this was a quote actually from Leon Dalloway from Shake, Rattle and Stir. So finally, the other piece in the puzzle is, what do our consumers think? So I did a quick analysis by asking my friends and family, put a note out on Facebook and Twitter to get some views. So there was a little bit of, I had to kind of ignore some of my colleagues at work because they're a little bit too much in the know. So I've tried to get a balanced view from gin geeks and mainstream consumers. Some people came back and said, I just drink what you tell me to drink, Joanne. So I had to take those ones out there, not appropriate. So some of the comments that came back were, I don't buy less than 40%. Other people said, I don't notice the ABV as long as the gin tastes good. Some people said, I appreciate the higher ABV for a higher priced gin. I feel it justifies the cost of my cocktail. I don't usually look, I tend to go with recommendations. That was the one I made nice about. They said, I normally go with what I tell them to drink. I don't look, assume most of them are the same. As long as I like the taste, I'm not bothered. And some people said a general trend was, I never look, it's all about taste. So to summarise these kind of, just a few of these points, because there was a few more, very few gin drinkers are aware of the variation in ABV between brands. Among those that are aware, they're not confident in stating what the ABV of their brand is. The general consensus is people don't mind as long as the gin tastes good. To some extent, we are still driven by marketing and branding of the gins. So people will dismiss those 37.5% ABVs if asked, but in reality, the standard gins is the segment which is still the biggest in our gin category, with a lion's share of 56%. So let's return to the original question at the beginning. Many new gins are moving away from the 37 and the 40% ABV norms to impress, or for good reason. In an ideal world, the creative process will drive the ultimate ABV level of the final product. But in reality, I believe it is a balance between the creative side and providing a commercial viable product. In other words, it depends on who you ask. And that's me done.